Welcome to the preaching and teaching ministry of Second Baptist Church, where we exist to delight in God, display His grace, and declare His gospel, all through Jesus Christ our Lord. We can be reached at www.2bcmtv.org or by calling 618-244-1706. We trust you'll be encouraged and challenged by the message you're about to hear.
If you have a Bible, and I hope that you do, if you'll turn with me to Psalm 128. We are currently 9 weeks into a sermon series on the Psalms of Ascent, spanning here from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134. And if you recall, I told you at the beginning that these were songs that the people of Israel would sing each year as they would ascend. They would go up to the city of Jerusalem, making these various pilgrimages to the city in order to celebrate the annually prescribed feasts and festivals of the people of God. And so these Psalms of Ascent, then, they are really an ancient road trip playlist. These are psalms that are meant to be sung. And if you've been with us for any length of time in this series, I think you can see why these psalms are worth singing. Amen? Why it might be helpful, why it might be beneficial to remind ourselves and to remind one another of these great truths that we've seen over the course of these last 8 weeks. I was just texting with a brother, a church member this past week, and we were both talking about how we have really been enjoying this study in the Psalms of Ascent. And I told them that, at least for me, part of the reason why I have been enjoying this so much is first because of the unhurried time I've been spending in the Psalms. I think it can be easy, oftentimes, especially in these short little Psalms, to just sort of rush past them. So the unhurried time, just to pause. But the other reason I think it's been so helpful for me is because of, and I've said this in weeks past, the God-centeredness of these Psalms. There has been something that has been just so overwhelmingly rich and helpful for my own soul, and I hope it has been for you as well, just to fix our eyes week after week after week after week upon the greatness and the glory of God and His eternal kingdom that's coming. And so it's not surprising then that's exactly where we find ourselves yet again here in Psalm 128. And yet again, we discover here how fixing our gaze on the glory of God and by living lives that are God-centered, it actually affects the way we live here and now. This present, ordinary life. And the blessing we're going to see from doing so. If you have your place there, let me invite you to stand with me out of honor for the reading of God's Word, if you're able. Psalm 128, beginning in verse 1, the psalmist writes, "A song of ascents. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in His ways. You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You can be seated. Well, I had originally considered entitling this morning's sermon, "Your Best Life Now." But I thought that might be too controversial. And then I thought about entitling it, "Your Blessed Life Now," but I decided that would be too cheesy. And so in the end, this morning's sermon is entitled, The Blessing of Fearing the Lord. The blessing of fearing the Lord. Friends, it isn't too difficult to discover very quickly the theme here of Psalm 128. What is the subject? What is the theme of this psalm? Well, while the author and the occasion of this particular psalm are unknown, its theme is actually rather obvious, isn't it? Because this psalm, it uses a particular word, it uses a particular expression 4 times. Did you notice it? Verse 1, blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. Verse 2, you shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands, you shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Verse 4, behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. Verse 5, the Lord bless you from Zion. So what then is the theme of this particular psalm? It's easy. It's blessedness. Blessedness. In fact, we might use the word happiness. Happiness. This is what it means to be happy. This is what it means to be blessed. Now, isn't that a theme, church, right now, that should grab your attention? What does it mean to be happy? So Psalm 128, we discovered this morning, is a very fitting psalm for us today. I mean, it's extremely relevant, isn't it? For us, but also, I think, for these days in which we are living. Because, in effect, Psalm 128 answers this question: how can I be happy in life? How can I be happy and find happiness? Friends, we are consumed with answering that question, aren't we? Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody is seeking happiness, the need to find happiness. Happy birthdays. Happy anniversaries, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas. In the immortal words of the great poet Pharrell Williams, I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. That's deep stuff. Friends, we live in a society that is absorbed with this idea of the pursuit of happiness. Everyone wants to be happy in life. It's what everybody's seeking, and yet there are many, many people that this pursuit, it seems elusive. It's out of reach. Why is that? Author David Wells, in his book, No Place for Truth, he writes this: the American way of life may be the envy of the world, its gadgets and furnishings sought after and emulated, but the American version of happiness, it turns out, is quite lethal. America is a violent and disturbed country. Its teenagers have the highest suicide rate in the world. It leads the world in the consumption of drugs, legal and illegal, in addictions of various kinds, in divorce, in the pervasiveness of depressive illnesses, and in the marketing of a vast range of therapies to counteract these problems, all of which, he says, points to a vast underlying unhappiness. We want to be happy, and yet many, many people, this happiness seems out of reach. Why? Well, here this morning, in Psalm 128, we find the answer. We find the biblical secret to happiness and blessing. In fact, we might call it the pathway to the blessed life, the happy life. So if we had to summarize it, Psalm 128, we might say that the key to the happy life, it doesn't come from one's possessions. It doesn't come from one's achievements. It can't be found in anything that is material or is temporal or is trivial. No, the secret to a happy life is living in the fear of the Lord. That's the answer. Living in the fear of the Lord. Look at verse 1. Blessed, happy is everyone who fears the Lord. Verse 4. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. That's the answer. It is the fear of God and delighting in God that thereby glorifies God. That is the chief end of man. That is why you exist on planet Earth. This is why, friends, our souls, which are eternal and spiritual, cannot find satisfaction, cannot find fulfillment, and cannot find meaning in the material and in the temporal, because we were created for God. And so this is the only way to find happiness. The fear of the Lord. Three things here the psalmist wants us to see about the blessing of fearing the Lord. First, we're going to see an invitation to blessing in verse 1. Where is God's blessing found? The psalmist is going to tell us where we find it. Second, he's going to give us illustrations of God's blessing in verses 2 to 4. And he gives three of them of how we see God's blessing in life, and three areas where we live in the fear of the Lord. And then finally, he's going to give a prayer for God's blessing in verses 5 and 6. He's looking off into the future. But first, just allow me, if you will, before we dig into these 3 points here, to make just a few general comments about this psalm. First of all, just notice Psalm 128, much like we saw last week in Psalm 127, is classified as a wisdom psalm. This is a psalm of wisdom. So it reads like Proverbs. So rather than direct praises to God, as we've seen in the Psalms of Ascent, or lamenting, the psalmist here is making general observations. He's stating here general truths about the world, about how to live a happy life, how to live a prosperous, fruitful life. That's what wisdom literature does for us. Which means, listen very carefully, because I want to say this up front so I don't have to keep making qualifications in the sermon. This psalm is teaching godly principles. It isn't a set of guaranteed promises. It is teaching godly principles. It isn't a set of guaranteed promises. For example, Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's not a promise. It's a principle. So we don't read these as guaranteed promises, but as general truths, general principles. Meaning, if you live like this, most of the time, this is how life is going to go for you. And that's very important to keep in mind when we see things like in verse 2, your work, or verse 3, your home life. So these are general principles, not guaranteed promises. And so, let me be very clear, this psalm doesn't guarantee health. This psalm doesn't guarantee wealth. It doesn't guarantee success or a problem-free life. No, the godly aren't immune to financial difficulties. The godly aren't immune to marital troubles or rebellious children. No, the blessings of God don't cancel out living reality in a fallen world. We all experience the effects of living in a post-Genesis 3 world, don't we? But the psalmist wants us to know that we can still, even now, experience the blessing of God. How? 3 ways. 3 things I want you to see here. First, an invitation to blessing. Verse 1. The psalmist is inviting us now into the blessed life. Where is God's blessing found? What kind of life does he bless? Where do we find happiness? Well, look at verse 1. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. That word blessed there, I told you, some scholars translate it as happiness. Happy is everyone who fears the Lord and walks in his ways. But it actually isn't very easily translated into English, this word here. But it could also be translated as fulfilled, happy, satisfied, enriched, blessed. In fact, the psalmist, he uses here two different Hebrew words for blessing. He uses one Hebrew word there in verse 1 for blessed, but he uses a different Hebrew word in verse 4 for blessed. Now, this is a big theme in the Psalms. Blessedness. If you remember, it's how the book of Psalms opens. The very first word, actually, of the book of Psalms. Psalm 1:1. Blessed is the man. Or Psalm 119, the longest psalm in the Psalter. Psalm 119, verse 1. Blessed are those whose way is blameless. This is a huge theme in the Psalms, this idea of blessing and fulfillment and happiness and life. And did you notice, verse 1, who this happy, blessed life is for? Verse 1, blessed is everyone who fears the Lord. In verses 1 and 4, he speaks generally in the third person. Notice, everyone, the man, verse 4. But then, notice in verses 2 and 3, he gets even more personal. He moves now to the second person, you. So this blessing, it's available to all. It's available to everyone. It's available to you. So then what does this blessed life look like? Well, again, look at verse 1. It comes in two parts. Here's the key to a happy life. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord and who walks in his ways. Those are parallel statements. I'll say that more about that in a moment. So happiness, he says, comes as a result of fearing God. Fearing God, which leads to ask a very important question. What does it mean to fear the Lord? First, I want you to notice the definition. The definition of fearing God. Verse 1. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord. Now, what does it mean to fear the Lord? What does that mean? Do we fear God like we fear heights? One author writes, fearing God is better described than it is defined. It's easier to describe what it is, really, than to define what it is. Jerry Bridges, in his book, The Joy of Fearing God, defines it as a profound sense of awe toward God. In fact, it goes on to call it reverential awe. Reverential awe. So it at least means a holy reverence for God, a holy respect for God, a holy esteem. That God is to be taken seriously. He isn't to be trifled with. That he's holy. He's awesome. So it's a mixture then of amazement and wonder and admiration directed toward God. John Murray, he defines it like this. He says, the fear which compels adoration and love. So now we bring in love. It is the fear which consists, he says, in awe, reverence, honor, and worship. It is the reflex of our consciousness to the transcendent majesty and holiness of God. That's what it means to fear God. And that idea, that phrase, the fear of God, is all over the Bible. It's found some 150 times in the Bible, and it's found in both the Old and the New Testament. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7, listen to this. Be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. So fearing God, notice there, is the opposite of being wise in your own eyes. It's this humility before the transcendent, awesome God. Isaiah 66, verse 2, but this is the one to whom I will look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles, he fears at my word. So notice, fear corresponds to humility. It corresponds to lowliness at the sheer majesty of God. His holiness, His justice, His power, His wrath, His love and mercy and grace. Or in the New Testament, Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, do not fear those who can kill the body, but can't kill the soul. Fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. So this idea of fearing God is all over the Bible. I mean, can you see it? But perhaps what many people fail to realize is that there's actually a right way to fear God and there's a wrong way to fear God. There's a right way and there is a wrong way. What's the difference? Well, perhaps it's better described than defined. Let me show you an example of what I mean. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. The Lord has given the 10 Commandments. You remember? The Israelites are gathered at Mount Sinai. They see the smoke. They see the fire from the mountain. They hear the thunder. And as a result, they are terrified. Verse 18. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And what does this kind of fear of God cause them to do? Verse 18. They stood far off. And in verse 19, they say to Moses, you speak, Moses, lest we, and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us lest we die. What does this fear of God cause them to do? Pull away, withdraw, run away from God. But in verse 20, look at there. Moses says to them, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. And then in verse 21, the people stood far off. Notice the contrast. While Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So in verse 20, Moses says, in effect, don't fear so that you can fear. Don't fear God so that you can fear God. What? In other words, there's two kinds of fear. There's two ways to fear God. One kind, the wrong way, causes you to shrink back. It's a fear that causes you to turn away and to run and to hide and to try to avoid God and stand at a distance. It's a fear that only sees the justice and the holiness and the wrath of God, and it stems from a wrong, or we'll just say incomplete, perception of God that causes you to shrink back from Him. But there's also another kind of fear. And it's the right kind of fear. It's the right way that actually causes you to draw near to Him. To run to Him rather than to run away from Him. Because you see, what the people of Israel had failed to remember is that the God of Exodus chapter 20 is also the God who in Exodus chapter 20 verse 2, look there, who said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I have redeemed you. I have freed you. I've made you mine. Or later in Exodus 34, the Lord says, I'm a God who's merciful and gracious and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That's the kind of God that I am. And so the first way, the wrong way, is based really only on this legal relationship where we want to escape from God. But the second way, the right way, it's actually based on a familial relationship that sees God as my Father, who is full of, yes, holiness and justice and wrath, but He's also a God who's full of mercy and grace and love. And now in Christ, He beckons us to draw near to Him in fear and wonder and joy, because the holiness and the justice and the wrath of God, it's been satisfied at the cross. So, church, how much more this side of the cross now should we stand in the awe and the fear of God? And yet I'm willing to bet that many of us, we relate to God the first way. The wrong way. And we think that's what it means to fear God. And as a result, it causes you to shrink back from Him. In fact, it causes you to do what you do, to behave and to act like you do. You refrain from doing certain things. You go to church. You try to be a good person because you live in the dread of stepping out of line and what He's going to do to you. Zap you. That's not godly fear. No. Don't mistake that for biblical fear. Godly fear is a fear that causes you to draw near to God in awe, wonder, enjoyment of God that's born out of love and adoration and worship for this awesome, holy, majestic God who's lavished grace and mercy upon you. And friends, it means we stand in and we marvel at who God is, that now it inclines us to do what pleases Him and honors Him and delights Him. In fact, Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11, Nehemiah says, it is a delight to fear your name. It's my joy now. In fact, that's what we see here in verse 1. Go back. Look at verse 1. We see here the definition of fearing God. But now we notice the evidence of fearing God. We've looked at the definition, now look at the evidence. If we truly fear God, then what will be the evidence in our lives? Look at verse 1, second half there. The evidence. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord. And then notice this next phrase, who walks in His ways. So verse 1, this is what's known as a parallelism here, meaning each line defines and explains the other one. So defining the fear of God actually isn't very hard at all. You know what fearing God means? You walk in His ways. That's what it means. Verse 1, that word walk there, it means your lifestyle. It means the way that you live your life. So the fear of the Lord is the cause. Walking in His ways is the effect. Now, let's be clear. Walking here, it doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean we're sinless, but walking does imply what? The overall direction, the overall trajectory, the overall pattern of your life. And the evidence that you fear God is you're going to walk in his ways. It is a fear that motivates holy living. So let me ask you, are you walking in his ways? Are you walking? Listen carefully. I'm always afraid I may say this and it sounds too harsh. I'm not asking if you've asked Jesus into your heart. In fact, I really don't care. Because that's not a biblical phrase. I'm not asking if you've prayed a sinner's prayer. I'm not asking if you have been baptized or you've heeded an altar call or your mama or your pastor promised you were saved and told you never, ever to doubt it. No, I'm asking you, do you fear the Almighty God and walk in his ways? Because if the honest answer of your heart is no, and yet you profess to be a Christian, friend, you are lost in a world of self-delusion. Do you fear God and walk in his ways? And the psalmist says, that's the answer to a happy life. A life that fears God and walks in his ways. So it isn't found in material, worldly pleasures, worldly comforts, worldly circumstances. It's found in knowing and fearing God and being in a right relationship with God. But then, notice in verses 2 to 4 now, he begins to give illustrations of what this blessed life looks like, and he gives 3 of them. Point number 2, illustrations of God's blessing. Verses 2 to 4. So notice how verses 1 and verse 4, look there, serve as parentheses. You see that? They serve as bookends to verses 2 and 3. So verse 1, blessed is everyone who fears the Lord and who walks in his ways. But then in verse 4, behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. So do you see those bookends? And in between those parentheses, we have examples now of a happy, blessed life. So follow the logic. Follow the logic here of the psalmist. When you fear God, you do what? You walk in his ways, right? And when we walk in his ways, it's going to have an influence on every single area of your life. You're going to begin to bring every single area of your life under the authority and in submission to him. And so the result is you're going to be blessed, you're going to be fulfilled, you're going to be happy. And in verses 2 and 3, he now gives 3 examples of this blessed life: our work, our marriage, and our children. A few brief observations here about verses 2 to 3. Nothing earth-shattering here, but it's important nonetheless. Observation number one, just notice how ordinary these blessings are. Work, marriage, family, dinner tables. I mean, this is ordinary stuff. So the psalmist goes from verse 1, the grandeur of fearing God, now in verses 2 to 3 to this just basic street-level view of just ordinary life. And yet, it's where God's blessing is seen. And the spheres of life in which we fear him. Observation number 2, notice how verse 4, the psalmist specifically addresses men. Look at verse 4. Thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. Now, I don't think that's by accident. It doesn't mean women can't be happy. He's just said in verse 1, blessed is everyone. But he does speak specifically here to men. Verse 2, this man has a job. Verse 3, this man has a wife and children. Verse 6, this man has grandchildren. Why the emphasis here on the man? Well, it seems, test me, that the psalmist is emphasizing that the man does have a God-given central role in both the home and in society. And as goes the husband and the father, so goes the family and society. Which leads to my third observation. Where there is no fear of God in the home, where there is no fear of God in society, there's only going to be chaos and disorder. Where there's no fear of God in the home or in society, there's going to be only chaos and disorder. We see this at a cultural level, don't we? I was really helped here by one commentator on this point. What happens to a culture and society where there's no fear of God? Friends, we are seeing a society right now functioning with no acknowledgement of the existence of God, right? And so the first thing to go is the sacred. But that's going to be felt then in every single sphere of life. So test this. Particularly first, it's going to happen in the home. And it's going to weaken the institution of marriage, accelerated divorce rates, rise in casual cohabitation, alternative relationships. It weakens the home. It weakens the family unit. And as a result of this weakening of the family unit, it results in a contempt for authority. Parental authority and civil authority, which leads to a sharp rise in juvenile delinquency. This weakening of the family also results in a steady decline of the man's natural motivation to provide for and to protect for his family. In other words, manliness is just gutted of manhood. And this kind of culture becomes absorbed with the pursuit of pleasure, sexual or otherwise, then an apathy towards civic duty, marked by economic decline, and all of that inevitably leads to this unimaginable increase in public spending because the government must compensate for the social inertia downward. Does that sound familiar at all? Friends, this is what inevitably happens when a home and a nation and a society doesn't fear the Lord. But for those who do, look at those examples. This is the blessed life now. There, I said it. He's not denying the blessing to come. He's going to get to that in verses 5 to 6. But this is now. When the fear of the Lord takes hold in your life, this is what will follow. 3 illustrations. Illustration number 1, notice our work. Verse 2, you shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Notice that 3-part blessing there. You'll eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You'll be blessed, and it will be well with you. So he's talking here about the blessing of God. He's talking about a happy life in our work. The labor of your hands. That yes, while we live in a post-Genesis 3 world, where if you remember the curse of God after Adam's sin was that our work would now be difficult, right? We're going to work by the sweat of our brow, but when the fear of God has taken hold of your life and it's rooted in your life, it transforms your view of work entirely. And now we understand that work is actually a divine blessing from God, and that despite the stresses and the demanding bosses and the deadlines and the coworker disputes and the mundane tasks, it's one of the primary ways, friends, in which we glorify God in how we work. So listen, perhaps, friend, one of the reasons why you hate your job, you hate going to work, it's not the only reason, but perhaps one of the reasons could be because you don't view it as an opportunity to glorify God and live in the fear of God. You work for something else, not the glory and honor of God. Paul says in Colossians 3, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. And friends, that's what will elevate your work to the sacred. Whatever you do. So do you see it as an opportunity to live in the fear of God and walk in his ways? That's a blessing. Your work is a blessing. And this sort of living is the key to a happy life. But notice that next illustration there in verse 3. The psalmist moves from the man's work to his home, from the workplace into the family, and it's quite the picture here. Look there. First, he addresses the most intimate of all human relationships. Illustration number 2, marriage. Marriage. Look at verse 3, the beginning there. When you live in the fear of the Lord and you walk in his ways, your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. You've no doubt heard the saying before, a happy wife is a happy life? No. A godly wife is a happy life. And in the same way, a godly husband will mean a happy wife. That's the picture here. Verse 3, that when the man orders his life around the fear of God, the woman he marries will be marked by the blessing of God. How so? Look at verse 3. The psalmist uses the image here of a vine. See that there? Verse 3. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. So the picture of the vine here, it doesn't just mean a picture of fertility or sexually, which are all divine blessings, and that imagery is used in other places in the Old Testament. But the fact that the godly wife is going to color and fill the man's home with life and beauty and goodness. Isn't that true, men? So it isn't only her capacity to bear and raise children, it is to bless her home and to grow her home, how she's a blessing to the family. That's a happy life. It's a blessed family. Now, the psalmist isn't naive, okay? He knows there are selfish attitudes and fights. He knows not all's marital bliss. I mean, this is life under the curse, but here's the reality. In Christ, everything now is transformed in the marriage. And it transforms this relationship, because the husband and wife, they both understand what? They both understand that now, in the fear of the Lord, in the gospel, the gospel is actually embedded now in this relationship. And so marriage isn't ultimately about me. It's not about me. It transcends me. And it points to something far greater than me. It points to this relationship between Christ and the church. And listen, that is going to change the dynamics of the relationship completely. It's key. And it infuses it now with meaning and purpose, and it elevates it to the level of the sacred. There's actually eternal significance here in what's happening. A marriage lived for the glory of God. And then, as is often the case, this marriage leads to what? Children. So just like work is a divine calling, marriage is a divine calling, so is raising kids. Quiverful. We saw last week, right? Some are fuller than others, but it feels full sometimes. And there we saw last week that children are a reward. They're a stewardship. They're a blessing, again, from God. So notice this third illustration, children, in verse 3. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. James Montgomery Boyce comments, I imagine that anyone who has ever tried to raise children comes to the Bible's pictures of domestic joy with a certain amount of skepticism. Domestic joy. There's disrespectful attitudes, there's harsh words, there's fighting and whining and long days and sleepless nights and laundry coming out your ears and dirty diapers and on and on and on and on it goes. And yet, the psalmist says children are the mark of a blessed life. Now just notice two things there. First, notice he calls them olive shoots. The psalmist, much like the vine right there, he's now using another agricultural metaphor. What do you know about olive shoots? Maybe not much about olive shoots. The olive shoot pictures in the Bible, specifically in the Old Testament, blessing. But again, Boyce comments, olive trees also take a long time to mature and become profitable. Longer perhaps than any other fruit-producing tree or plant. But, he says, patiently cultivated, they become quite valuable. So olive shoots grow slowly, and they must be cultivated. And wild shoots at times need to be pruned, and they need to be disciplined in the fear of the Lord. But when they are, the psalmist says, it will become fruitful. That's parenting under the fear of God. And so I just want to encourage our young families to take in your parenting the long view here, okay? The long view. And I want to remind you that parenting, it is a divine calling. It is a divine blessing. And the fear of God should transform the way you parent. And that parent-child relationship, it isn't a chore. It isn't a burden. It isn't an inconvenience. The Bible says it's a blessing. And it means a fruitful, happy life. But there's another thing here about this. Look there in verse 3. Your children will be like olive shoots. And I just want to point this out. Around your table. What is a blessed life? Listen, I'm not sure what you think it is. What you're chasing to bring you happiness. The psalmist says, what I want you to do is I want you to stop looking out there for happiness. Stop looking out there for fulfillment. And just look at these little olive shoots he's put around your table. I made it my daily habit now, dads. As I'm driving home from work, I only got 2 blocks, so it's got to be quick, to pray and ask the Lord to give me grace when I walk through the door to see my wife and my children as a blessing from God. And to live in such a way under the fear of the Lord to cultivate my home and to cultivate my marriage and my children so that there's lasting fruit and lasting blessing. That's the blessed life, he says. And I know I said I wasn't going to make any qualifications, but I'm going to. I've got the microphone, so you got to listen to me. I know there's some of you, you have known loss and you've known tragedy. You've known the loss of a spouse, a failed marriage, infertility, the loss of a child. There's an empty seat maybe around the table. Hear me. The Lord is no less committed to showing you blessing and joy, even though your life may be colored by all kinds of suffering. If you fear Him, you will experience joy and blessing in this life. And I want to say to you, singles, that if you're not married and you don't have kids, you don't have to in order to experience the blessing of God in your life either. Do you have friends? Do you have a church family? Do you have parents? Do you have food on the table? It's a blessing from the Lord. You two are blessed. So fear God wherever He's put you. These are examples of the happy life. Do you want to be happy? The Lord says, then do your work unto me. Love your spouse unto me. Raise your children unto me. That's how you're going to serve me in meaningful, tangible ways. Finally, the prayer for God's blessing. A prayer for God's blessing, verses 5 and 6. Verses 1 and 4, he tells us the secret to a happy life. Fear the Lord, walk in His ways. Sandwiched there, verses 2 and 3, examples of the blessed life. And now, look at verses 5 and 6, he shifts gears and he prays. And this prayer expands from himself, notice, and his family, to the entire people of God, and to the city, and to the nation, and into the future. Verse 5, the Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. Three brief things here about this prayer as we close. Number one, notice it is a prayer for prosperity. A prayer for prosperity. Verses 5 and 6. Notice how this prayer for God's blessing, it extends from the family now outward to the community. Do you see that? Verse 5, may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Verse 6, peace be upon Israel. So he wants to see this blessing, this peace, this prosperity, where? Not only in his own family, but he wants to see it in his homeland, in his city, in his community. And so, church, I think there's good reason here for us to seek the welfare of our own city. Jeremiah 29, verse 7, if you remember when the people of Israel were carried off into Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah said, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which he's carried you into exile. In other words, Babylon. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So we should seek and pray for God's blessing in our community and in our nation. And friends, that only comes how? By a proper fear of God, which means they must hear. We must go and tell them, because this blessing only comes through a right relationship with God through Jesus Christ. In fact, notice back in Psalm 2, let me just point this out to you, Psalm 2. The psalmist says there, what's the blessed life? Verse 12. Kiss the Son. That's the Christ, the Messiah, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. Hide in him. Trust in him. And I think this prayer of blessing, it extends as well, not only to our community, but also to the church. The people of God, after all, it was in Jerusalem. He's praying for the peace of Jerusalem here, right? The blessing, it's in Jerusalem God would dwell. That's why they're headed there, to celebrate, right? But brothers and sisters, now in the new covenant, God's blessing, his presence no longer dwells in a temple, it's in his people. It's in the church. And so we should pray for and seek and esteem the good and the blessing and the fruitfulness of our church. Do you want to experience the blessing of God now? It's through the church. You can't disconnect a happy life from the church. But then, notice something else about this prayer. Number 2, a prayer for future generations. Look there, verse 6. I'm almost done. May you see your children's children. So verse 5, this is about the blessing of God all the days of your life. But verse 6, this is about the blessing of God beyond the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Beloved, he's talking here about a fruitful legacy. I mean, it's a great thing, verse 5, to see your children. It's an even greater thing to see your children's children, he says. Your grandkids. Someone said, if I knew having grandchildren would be this great, I would have had them first. Grandchildren, Proverbs 17:6 says, are the crown of the aged. Listen, I think there's a word here from many in this church who have grandkids. What kind of legacy are you going to leave? I mean, what's the lasting legacy you're going to leave? Someone say, well, I made mistakes with my own kids. Okay. That's in the past. There's grace for that. How are you going to invest in your grandkids now? What kind of legacy are you going to leave. It's a prayer of blessing for the future generations. And then finally, a prayer of blessing. God's prayer, or a prayer for God's blessing in the eternal kingdom to come. Verses 5 and 6. Notice here, the psalmist is looking here beyond the present, and he's looking into the future. Look there, verse 5. Where do you see this? The Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem. Now, verse 5, in some measure, he's talking about Jerusalem that day, but I think he's looking into the future. Because those words there, Zion, Jerusalem, they should evoke in your mind ideas of God's kingdom and God's king that's coming. You remember back in Psalm 122 where we said in verse 5, David's singing about Jerusalem. Why? Because there in Jerusalem, in Zion, thrones of judgment were set, the thrones of the house of David. Why is he praying for the blessing of Zion? Because he's looking and he's awaiting for the city that is to come. The prosperity of Jerusalem, ultimately the new Jerusalem that's coming, where God's king is going to reign. And so what's he praying for here? He's praying for God's future eternal kingdom that is to come. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. When Christ will come and he's going to restore God's kingdom and rule and reign, and God's peace and shalom and its blessing is going to extend to all the nations of the earth. And we'll be with him forevermore. The fountain of all blessing. And so all of the blessings then that we experience now, this work and family and satisfaction in life, friends, it is merely a foretaste of the eternal blessing that's coming. It's the amuse-bouche. You know what amuse-bouche is? It's French. It's in fancy restaurants, so I don't get it much, but amuse-bouche. It's a single bite that's brought to you before the meal, to give you a little taste of what is to come when the meal arrives. Friends, the blessings now are the amuse-bouche. Psalm 16:11, you made known to me the path of life. In your presence, there's fullness of joy. And at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. That's the blessing of what's coming. Let's pray.
We trust you were encouraged by the message you heard. For more information about our church, visit us online at www.2bcmtv.org or call us at 618-244-1706. And thank you for listening.